right, guys, welcome back to Revive School. Here we are, lesson 74, Ezekiel 47 and 48. Guys, we made it. No, we haven't finished, but we made it to the end of Ezekiel 47 and 48. Man, this has been a crazy book. I mean, it has been crazy. All kinds of interesting components. What's one thing, Kevin, that you like about Ezekiel?
I think the details, like everything has a lot of details because he's singing it and he's trying to write it down and communicate.
Yeah. Rich, what do you think? What's one thing you like about Ezekiel?
The fact that he hears from the Lord and that he's conscious enough to do what the Lord asks of him. As crazy as what the Lord has shown him is. And
he just keeps doing it. I mean, you think about this, Mindy's illustration of the death of life. Here you have the valley of the dry bones, right? And then the next thing you know, in Ezekiel 37, we're talking about the valley of dry bones. And then the next thing you know, today, here we are in 47 and 48, and we're talking about new life. What an awesome picture. And the imagery there is extremely powerful. And just to go, Mindy, I love the fact that here you had the valley of dry bones, and then you put a sword there, because what happens to these guys? These guys then become an army. They become soldiers. And you're kind of like, man, that's incredible, powerful image. And then even if you didn't catch this earlier, here you have completely just dead, vast deadness. And then here you have life. And what we're going to talk about today, you guys, is that through this river, this is an incredible story, you will experience life on so many levels. And let me just say, geographically, you'll see ridiculous changes. I mean, think about this. We've been talking about the land, right? This is what we've been talking about. You know, back in the earlier days with Abraham, God promised land to Abraham. It was very apparent. Later on, he became more specific to his sons, Isaac and Jacob, and then it continued to unfold into the lineage. So I'm going to give you this land. And there's always this condition. If you're unfaithful, I will kick you out of the land. If you're faithful, I will give you the land. Go to Deuteronomy 7, if you don't mind, Kevin. Deuteronomy 7, verse 12. Like, this is constantly the image of this, I'm going to give you this land. Deuteronomy 7, verse 12, it says, if you listen to and are careful to keep these ordinances, the Lord your God will keep his covenant loyalty with you. I was just thinking about a loyal card, Kevin, you got a text from Circle K, like you're a faithful customer there, right? If you're faithful, you're going to keep getting these rewards. This is what's happening. Like, if you're faithful, I'm going to keep my covenant with you as he swore to your fathers. Like, this is the language, like, I'm going to give you the land. So yesterday, what did we hear? Ezekiel talked about how God says, this is my land forever. How cool is this? Kevin, can you go to our box? Here you have in the middle of this, yes, you have the temple. I mean, this is the incredible land that we talked about yesterday. This whole story blows my mind. Like, I kind of want to go back here today, just so you know, to talk about this. We don't even know who the prince is, but he's got land. Then you got some workers that are working the land. You got the ag, and then you have a city. It's called The Lord is There. Like, God is truly keeping his promise. And the geography is changing. It's shifting. And that's really where I want to get into today. You're going to see future blessings. Like, when I see that, the holy rectangle, I think of blessing. So I think of the presence of God, and I think of blessing. The Lord is there. Yahweh is there. So when you start thinking through this, you guys, when you get into Ezekiel, specifically 47, you're going to see the shift in the, not just the quote-unquote atmosphere, but actual land. You're going to see a shift. Now, this takes time during the millennium. Okay, so again, some of you probably get tired of me drawing this out. Ezekiel, he's in captivity, okay, in Babylon, okay, along with at least 10,000 other exiles, right?
Probably at this time a few more than that.
Yeah, probably at this time a few more than that. So now here's the process, okay? Can you go to my kings and priests chart if you don't mind? So Ezekiel is talking about, by the way, they're going to leave captivity, right, Kevin? And eventually they're going to come back and Jerusalem is going to be somewhat restored, right? You're going to see the rebuilding of the second temple, right? We will see Zerubbabel is going to play a part of this. So you will see the second temple being built, okay? Because we already know the problem is in 586 BC, it's already destroyed, right? This is the process. 586, now you're going to see it being rebuilt. Kevin, eventually, though, what's going to happen in 70 AD?
Destroyed again.
So the temple is destroyed again. The reason I want to say this is because what we're going to describe with this geographical change, we know that it's not the Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the second temple, Because he's talking about something way more than just like coming back to a city being restored, coming back to a temple being restored. Why? Because it was eventually destroyed again. So, 30 plus years, 35, 40 plus years after Jesus was on earth, the temple was destroyed again, which, by the way, Jesus talked about, right? So this is the process. This is where we're at. So, again, you have the first temple, the second temple. We are now talking about the millennial temple. This is where I want to go today, okay? And I think for me, you have to keep understanding this. So Ezekiel is talking to his buddies. He hears something from the Lord, and he says, guys, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be good. It's going to get better. And that's the image that you have. And so when you look in verse 1, he's going to begin to talk about a river. It says, then he, this is the original guide. This is the guide that's been kind of like Ezekiel's buddy, taking him everywhere. He takes me back to the entrance of the temple, and there was water flowing from under the threshold of the temple toward the east. Now, Rich, if you heard water under the threshold, what would you think?
I would think there's a leak somewhere.
Yeah, there's a leak. This is a good leak, okay? This is a ridiculous, powerful leak. And Kevin, which way is the water going?
It's going east.
It's going towards the east, for the temple faced east. So what does he see? Ezekiel sees water flowing. The water was coming down from under the south side of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. It continues on in verse 2. It says, next, he brought me out by way of the north gate, and he led me around the outside to the outer gate, okay? So he took me on the outside. So, I guess just on the outside, the outer wall, right? To the outer gate that faced east, so we're probably going to be over on this side, so out here is where he would be taking him. And it says, there the water was trickling from the south side. And I love the fact that it's a trickle. Okay, when I think of a river, I think it should flow. If you guys have ever been whitewater rafting, like you want rapids. This is just a nice trickle. Okay, this is the imagery that we have. And then it says in verse 3, as the man went out east with the measuring line, kind of a cool image. Again, it makes you go back to Ezekiel 40, verse 3. In his hand, he measured off 1/3 of a mile, and he led me through the water. And it came up to my ankles. So here you have the river. Let's just say it's flowing, let's just say this way, okay? Kevin, first of all, how far did it go? He went how far?
1/3 of a mile.
So it comes up to his ankles, okay? This is a water that's going. Then he says, this is the man with him. Then he measured off 1/3, again, 1/3 of a mile, and he led me through the water. And it came up to what did it come up to next?
Knees.
His knees. Okay, so it continues on. It says, then he measured off another 1/3 of a mile, and he led me through the water, and it came up to my waist. Okay, so this angel is taking, right? This angel is taking, and I love this. Angels are ministering spirits. I think this is a cool picture. This angel is taking Ezekiel, and then what it says in verse 5, as it's getting deeper, Kevin, it says, again, he measured off 1/3 of a mile. It was a river that I could not cross on foot. So no longer, I can't walk across this. It says it was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be crossed on foot. So you can just say, we'll just say, now you're swimming. This angel asks Ezekiel, hey, do you see this, son of man? I'd be like, hello, I'm in it, right? I'm in the water, I'm in swimming. And then he led me back to the bank of the river. Why? Because he has been in the river. Scripture says so let's hang out there, okay, for a second. Ankles, knees, waist, swim. I love this image. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Kevin, can you go to Zechariah 14, verse 8? Man, this is ridiculous. When you begin to put all of these pictures, go to verse 4 actually first. Zechariah 14, verse 4. Again, here you have a minor prophet. So remember how we said you got to look to the east, right? Remember that the Messiah is coming back from the east, and it says he's going to put his feet on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. To the Mount of Olives, it will be split in half from east to west. And what does it do? It forms a huge valley so that half the mountain will move to the north and half to the south. So, Kevin, now you have a mountain, and now what do you have?
A valley in between.
A valley in between. So now if you go to verse 5, he says this, you will flee by my mountain valley, for the valley of the mountains will extend as well. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come and all of the holy ones with him. So Jesus comes to Mount of Olives, splits it, valley takes place, okay? Keep going. It says, and then on that day there will be no light. The sunlight and the moonlight will diminish. Verse 7. It will be a day known only to Yahweh, without day or night, but there will be light at evening. In other words, we don't know when this is going to happen. We don't have any idea when he's coming back. Now watch in verse 8. It says, on that day, think about this. When Christ comes back, valley is now formed. Mount of Olives is split. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it toward the eastern sea and the other half toward the western sea, in summer and winter alike. So now all of a sudden, when Christ comes back, you have, look what it says, living water. It's going to flow from Jerusalem. And here's the crazy part, Kevin. It's actually like this is the little trickle that we're talking about. But now we're talking about a river, right, that's going to go to the eastern sea and then towards the western sea. I just want you to have that image of when His presence is here, you will have and experience living water. In John 7, verse 37 and 38, it says, on that last day and most important day of the festival, Jesus stood up and He said, look, if anybody's thirsty, he should come to me and drink. And the one who believes in me, Scripture says in verse 38 says, and the Scripture has said, will have streams of living water flow from deep within him. So here you have Christ in a crazy cool way. And Kevin, it goes to this whole temple thing. Like we are, right, a temple, His temple, right? It's in us, but now in the millennium, it's like everything is manifested about what you experience in the new covenant. It's so crazy. The Old Testament talks about it, right? The New Testament, we actually get to be that. And then in the millennium, all of those worlds combine, where it's now we have the living water and we get to see the living water. It's a crazy picture here. And that's just a river. There's more rivers that he talks about. And in fact, it gets kind of confusing to the point where you're like, okay, which river are we now talking about? I want to unpack this just a little bit because what this river does, okay, I'll start unpacking this. Let me get to the cheesy part for a second.
Oh, boy.
The ankles. Just go along. I don't do the application much. I just think it's interesting. J. Vernon McGee, right? J. Vernon McGee, I love his perspective. He says, think about it this way. The ankles could represent the walk of the believer in the Spirit. Like you're walking. Like that's the process. So there's a walk of the believer in the Spirit. The knees, okay, could be, let me just say this. The ankles could represent the walk. The knees could represent prayer. Like just think through this process of, it speaks of prayer. When you get to the waist, it speaks of service, like the loins. Gird up your loins. And so all of a sudden, as you're walking it out, you're praying. It's just a thought of the service. Now, here's what I love, and this is why I wanted to do this. The waters to swim in. What does this indicate? Honestly, to me, it's the fullness of the Lord in His blessings. In the fullness of the Lord, in experiencing His blessings in the millennium. Does that make sense? It's kind of like there's this progression as you get to go through this. But let me just say this. If you're not walking this out, you don't get to experience the fullness of the Lord. I actually think many people are stuck at the ankles. I really actually think many people are stuck at the knees. And you're like, well, Kyle, I like to pray. You should pray. But when God tells you to do something, you should walk it out. You should act it out with a service. And at that point, then you get to experience the fullness of the Lord. I preached at Josh Edwards' former church that he was a worship pastor at sometime in the last year. And when I was done preaching, I had nothing to do with, I was not preaching at all on Ezekiel. A woman had come up to the pastor and she said, I have a word for this guy. And so I've never seen this lady. So she comes up and she speaks. What does she do? She prophesies over my life, Ezekiel 47. And she walks through the progression of ankles, knees, waist, and swim. And then she begins to walk through when you experience the fullness of God walking out the living water. What happens? Well, that's what's cool. In verse 7 of Ezekiel 47, you get to actually experience an abundance of His fruit. He says, so remember, he goes back to the bank. He says, when I went back to the bank, I saw a very large I saw a very large number of trees along both sides of the riverbank. He said to me, this water flows out to the eastern region, right? And goes down to the Arabah, okay? When it enters the sea, this is so crazy. So this living water in the fullness of the Lord, right? Now what do you see? You see trees along both sides of the riverbank. So can you imagine just, Mindy, your painting here of this incredible river. Can you imagine it going all the way from the temple, all the way to the Dead Sea, and just lined with trees all the way on both sides? That's where you're saying there's so much imagery. What do I even paint? It says when it enters the sea, so when this living water that came from the temple, right, in the millennium, 1,000 years, Christ is already here. The Mount of Olives has already split, right? Okay, He's already here. The priests have their land. The Zadoks have already their land. The prince has his land. And now you got this river that's flowing from Jerusalem. Yahweh is here, right? This is Yahweh's home. And now it's flowing all the way, it says, to the sea of foul water. That's the Dead Sea. This water, this river, this living water is going to flow from Jerusalem, the presence of God, all the way to the Dead Sea. The water, and then it says, the water of the sea becomes fresh. This right here brings life to the Dead Sea. Living water from the presence of God brings life to the Dead Sea. Kevin, you haven't been able to float on the Dead Sea yet. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Rich, you have. Tom, you guys have. Mindy, you have.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they call it Dead Sea?
Because nothing lives in it. The salt content is so high, there's no life forms in there.
So all of this Dead Sea, this water that nothing grows in, you're telling me that a prophet, Kevin, let's go to this. Could you go to the timeline? You're telling me that a prophet heard from the Lord with an angel at a bank of a river. So here you have Ezekiel when he's 30 years old, starting off as a priest and a prophet, 593 BC. You're telling me that he heard from the Lord that the Dead Sea that we now see, experience, that's dead is actually going to come to life.
By water flowing into it.
By water flowing into it. Where would you want to buy real estate property? Probably. I mean, I'm not an expert or anything, but I'd sure say buy property around there. It's probably pretty good. My point is this, you're going to experience a miracle. In the millennium, living water is going to bring life to the Dead Sea. What an absolute ridiculous story. Look at verse 9. Every kind of living creature that swarms will live wherever the river flows. There'll be a huge number of fish because this water goes there. Huge number of fish. Since the water will become fresh, there will be life everywhere the river goes. I mean, just so you know, Tom, you've driven there. You've driven there from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. What's the geography look like a little bit around the Dead Sea?
Well, I mean, it's just dry and rocky and mountainous and desert looking, and you just go down, down, down.
Yep. The whole place is just, it looks like a desert. And I mean, we've done Masada. We've hiked up Masada. You know how hot it is and miserable? Remember those little annoying bugs? Those are annoying. Now watch this in verse 10. Because of the river, because of the trees, because of all the fish, fishermen now are going to stand beside it from En Gedi to En Eglaim. These will become places where nets are spread out to dry. Their fish will consist of many different kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. It's interesting, this whole imagery of En Gedi to En Eglaim. En Gedi is clearly, people don't really dispute this, it's on the Dead Sea's west bank. Okay, so most people would say, okay, I understand where that is. About halfway along its length, near Masada. But the En Eglaim doesn't quite fit because according to this image, it looks like they're on both sides, right? You would think that they would describe on both sides of the river. And Eglaim could be near Qumran, okay, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some, though, argue for it to be on the site of the east so that you could have this imagery of fishermen on the west and on the east. I don't know, but the point is it's going to be an abundance. An abundance of fishermen because water is going to trickle from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. And I don't know if you guys remember a couple days ago, maybe it was even yesterday, we alluded to how the priests still have to use salt for the offerings at the temple. If you go to verse 11, look at this. It says, yet it's swamps. So we know that the Dead Sea has been, now it's fresh water. But yet it says its swamps and marshes will not be healed. They will be left for salt. Why? Because the temple is still functioning. They probably are going to need tangible salt. So it says in verse 12, all kinds of trees providing food will grow along both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither and their fruit will not fail. Each month they'll bear fresh fruit. Each month, you guys, because the water comes from the sanctuary. Kevin? What? The waters come, what's the headwaters of this living water?
The temple.
The headwaters of this living water is straight out of the source of God. And their fruit will be used for food and their leaves will be... Now this kind of messes me up and I'd love to get Rich's perspective on this. Their fruit will be used for food and their leaves for medicine. We're in the millennium. Anybody want to take a stab at that? Why do you need Tylenol and Advil in the millennium? Any thoughts?
Well, it doesn't say in the millennium there won't be any sin.
Correct.
There will be people that'll make it through the tribulations.
Got it. I want to make sure everybody understands that there is sin that takes place in the millennium. It's not perfect. So here's this image. Now, I do want to just say this. There's a couple other rivers that I want at least you to be aware of this imagery. Because Mindy, one of the things, why did you always integrate flowers in your paintings?
To represent the garden, like the original Garden of Eden.
Okay, so to represent the original Garden of Eden. So what's your end goal by the end?
To bring you back to the garden.
Good. All right, I want to do this. Can you go to Genesis 2:10? This is a little bit of an interesting study. Remember, we're talking about the rivers of living water that comes trickling out. Now watch. In Genesis 2:10, it says, a river went out from Eden to water the garden. From there it divided and became the source of 4 rivers. So we know that there was an original river in the Garden of Eden, okay, that served as a source, okay? That's at the beginning. Now watch this, Kevin. Can you go to Revelation 22, verse 1 and 2? Beginning river, and then here in Genesis, Revelation. Okay, now remember John, which we haven't got to the book of Revelation yet, but it says, then he showed me the river of living water, sparkling like crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Now, if you just stayed right there, what does this sound like?
Ezekiel.
This sounds like Ezekiel, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Now keep going to verse 2. Down the middle of the broad street of the city, the tree of life was on both sides of the river, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit every month. That sounds very similar. The leaves of the tree are for healing the nations. Verse 3, and there will no longer be any curse. The throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city, and his slaves will serve him. Now, okay, it says there will no longer be any curse. It sure sounds like this, Kevin, but I want to just do a little bit of a comparisons, okay? So you have the Garden of Eden river, right? You've got Revelation 22 river, and you have 4 rivers that we've talked about. Because then we have Zechariah 14 river, right? That says when he comes back, it's going to split, come through the valley, and then boom, here you go. Now you have more river, and that's going to go this way. So I want to just kind of hopefully start tying some of this in. Both rivers in Ezekiel and Revelation, okay? This comes from Warren Wiersbe. They flow from the throne of God. He is the source of the river. I think we're okay in saying he's the source of the river. However, there will be a temple in the millennial earth. Right? We would agree. There's a temple in the millennial earth, but there won't be one in the eternal state. After the 1,000-year reign, there's no temple. So, when you get to Revelation 20, can you go to Revelation 21:22? Yeah. I did not see a sanctuary in it because the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its sanctuary. Okay. Did everybody catch that? So, the millennium is a preparation for the eternal state, the new heaven, the new earth, whatever you want to call it, after the 1,000 years. And guess what? There's still a river. That make sense? Garden of Eden, there's a source of a river. You get into Ezekiel, I hope you guys are with me. In Ezekiel 47, you have a new river that establishes life to the Dead Sea that comes from the holy sanctuary, right? But when you get into after the 1,000 years, there's no sanctuary. It is God the Father and it is God the Son, Jesus the Lamb. They are the sanctuary, and that's where the river flows. Kevin, you want to try to tackle any more of that?
Not right now.
All right, guys, let's kind of wrap this up here. Remember this. Ezekiel is, our phrase is new David, okay? Ezekiel is the new David. And why I say that, because part of the role in Ezekiel 34 is he serves as the good shepherd, right? He serves as a shepherd where he's gathering his flock, the little sheep that have gone everywhere. Remember, they've been scattered north, south, east, west. He's gathering them, and what is he doing? He's bringing them back to the land. Right? That's part of New David. That's part of his role. He's bringing them back, the good shepherd. So when you begin to see in 13 and on, you begin to see, it goes back to this land. I've allocated land for my people. Well, he has to have had come back, right? The millennium, he's already come back and he's gathered his flock. So now what is he doing? He's giving them locations. He says, this is the border you will use to divide the land as an inheritance for the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? Now, this 12 tribes of Israel. So you feel like it's all coming together. Can you go back to our holy rectangle? Okay, now remember, so he's going to divide the land with the 12 tribes. These 12 tribes, you guys, is going to be north of the Levites portion. So now all of this tribal portions, okay, that you're going to see some of it, okay? Now watch. You have another one, Kevin. You have another map, okay? It's not just north. You're going to see it's all of the land. Here you have this little bright light, right? Okay, this is not an alien. This is the holy portion. This is the holy rectangle. So when he comes back in Ezekiel 47, what is he going to do? He's going to divide the land. And Kevin, what does he do? He allocates all of the 12 tribes, right? All of the tribes with their land. And it says Joseph will receive 2 shares. And then he begins to walk through this process. So in Ephraim and Manasseh, and he says, you'll inherit it in equal portion, since I swore it to give to your ancestors. So this land will fall to you as an inheritance. And then he says in verse 15, this is to be the border of the land. On the north side. So what does he do? In verses 15 and on, how else to describe this? In verses 15 through 23, he describes the north regions. So 15 to 17, the north portion. In verse 18, he describes the eastern portion. In verse 19, he describes the southern portion. And then really in verse 20, he describes the western portion. And then he says in verse 21, remember, Ezekiel hears this, right? You're to divide this land among yourselves according to the tribes of Israel. Okay, does that make everybody? So what you're seeing is, yes, we just talked about how he's going to allocate land here. Yes, we just talked about how the river is going to bring life to the Dead Sea. That's right here. Trees are going to be growing. Fruit's going to be growing. And abundance is going to be growing. And then in all of this, because there's life now back to the land, I want you to allocate all of the land during the millennium. Okay, this is the process. This is all during the millennium. All of this is going to take place. And the cool part is, here it is in verse 22 and 23. He says, you'll allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the foreigners living among you. Rich, if you're a foreigner in Israel, what does this verse mean possibly?
It means you have land.
It means you can have land. It means that if you are not a native Israelite, but you happen to be a foreigner living among them, he says maybe you have land. Not maybe, you do. Who have fathered children among you. You will treat them like native-born Israelites. Along with you, they'll be allotted inheritance among the tribes of Israel. And then he says in verse 23, in whatever tribe the foreigner lives, you will assign his inheritance there. This is the declaration of the Lord God. In other words, I don't know how else to put this. If you are living in Israel in this time, and you're walking with the Lord, clearly that you have, right? I think that's what we're implying. He says, hey, if you're living in Reuben, I'm going to give you some land. Hey, if you're living in the tribe of Ephraim, they have to give you some land. Like, this is the picture. I love this picture. It gives us hope for the Jews and the Gentiles, even in this time. The only thing I want to add in Ezekiel 48, just because I think it's a unique fact, in verses 1 through 2, the tribe of Dan is actually present in the millennium. The tribe of Dan is going to be present in the 1,000-year reigns. But the interesting part is that when you read Revelation 7, 4 through 8, the tribe of Dan is absent in the part that was allowed in the Great Tribulation. So here's what I see, okay? That Dan didn't serve in the Great Tribulation, but yet God still allowed them to come in the millennium. Make sense? Still hope for anybody. That's what I love about Ezekiel. The new David, the good shepherd, he's gathering his flock. It doesn't look good, but yet he still gathers them because he loves them. And all this is because of Jesus. So folks, when you think about this, just find hope in him. That's what will get us through. All right, guys, it's been a great pleasure sounding out Ezekiel 47, 48. Don't worry, we'll get into Daniel tomorrow. Have a great day. Thanks.